Anibojo Niganizi Equa Shane Nintishnakas Takaronto Equa Williams Treaty Nindonji Amek Nododem Anishinaabe Nishmanadoag Endao. So I'm Shane. I am with the Native Youth Sexual Health Network. I will tell you more about who we are after Beze introduces themselves.
Ani Boju, Winzgrandishkas, Makwandodem, Amchang Donjba, Anishinaabe Endao. So I like to say before I introduce myself in English is that I introduce myself in Ojibwe first. For people in the room that may speak Ojibwe, also we're very spiritual people. I come from actually 4 different people. I come from the Potawatomi, the Anishinaabe, Oneida, and Lenape/Delaware people. And so I introduced myself as well as to bring what we still believe is our ancestors are in the room, and so to bring them closer into the space and the discussion as well. So what I said was, hi, hello, my name is Lindsay Gray. I am Bear Clan. My preferred name is Beze, and I am from Amjanong, and I am Anishinaabe.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so the Native Youth Sexual Health Network. We are a by and for Indigenous youth organization working across Turtle Island. So we are not just a Canadian or an American organization. We kind of mess with those borders, which is great. And we work across issues of sexual and reproductive health, rights, and justice, which to us literally just means our bodies are spaces. So it means everything, every places that our bodies are in, everything that our bodies are doing, all of those things are issues that we work across. So you might be like, well, that's a lot of things, which it is. We are governed by 3 national Indigenous youth councils and like a collection of youth leaders, national youth leaders, which is awesome. A lot of spaces don't always do that. So, but this is some of our key areas of work. We do anything, literally anything from cultural safe sex to human rights and youth activism, prison abolition to Two-Spirit and LGBTQ advocacy to what we'll be talking about today, which is environmental justice and the connection to our bodies, to the connection between our bodies and the land. If you want to talk more about this at any time, that's something to earmark for questions. But today specifically, we're here to talk about this toolkit that was developed last year in 2016, and it is the Violence on the Land, Violence on Our Bodies toolkit, and it's specifically, specifically today, let me just say, specifically what it looks at is the connection between the violence that's happening on our land. So if we think about all the environmental destruction, mining, all of those things that are deeply embedded in the toolkit, and there's tons of examples of that, but we'll talk a little bit about that today and what that is, how that is impacting the bodies of Indigenous women, Two-Spirits, and youth and children in our communities. This particular toolkit is a partnership between 10 communities, and so these, as you see again, across Turtle Island. So it's not a specific territory, it's not a specific nation that we spoke to or were collaborating with, which is really kind of amazing and really special that we were able to build so many relationships and carry so many stories. Beze will talk more later about one of the specific studies that happened or one of the stories, I should say. But before we actually get into some of the nitty-gritty education information, at NYSHN, we don't really like just talking at people. So the first thing that we're going to do is an activity. So if you have a piece of paper, take it out. If you have a computer, that's cool too. If you just want to use your brain, that's awesome. That's, self-determination. You choose what's right for you. And we're going to do the toolkit has a lot of information. It has all those things that you want, like statistics, experiences, stories. But it's also a toolkit. So it has strategies and tools and ways that our communities can things that they can actually use to better understand their experiences, what's happening in their territories, and what's happening in the communities too. So the toolkit at the end of the report, which has all that information in it, has a lot of activities, some charts, things like that. Some of them are for wellness and self-care, and others are for things like assessments about the land or any type of violence that's happening. So this I was probably a cross between. So specifically, we wanted to do this particular activity because we want folks to start thinking about what we're talking about today. And I'm sure you all in different ways have been, but we're going to ground ourselves in this. So this activity, in the toolkit, there is a lot more information about it, but I'm not going to put all that on a slide. But it's really quick. So this piece of artwork was made by Erin Consumo, who is who also works for the Native Youth Sexual Health Network. She is a Métis Two-Spirit, a fabulous artist out in Alberta. And she actually is a graduate, too, of the Environmental Studies program at York University, so that's cool. She created this art piece. It's Our Bodies Are Not Terra Nullius. And the activity is really simple. It is I would say it's a mindful activity. You are literally just answering these two questions. So we're going to give you a couple minutes to think about it. And the first question is just, how are Indigenous territories, including our waters and lands, considered to be empty? So for folks who are not familiar with terra nullius, that concept is one of the primary concepts behind how colonizers, or however we want to say it, decided or used as a reason to come here, because this land was empty. It didn't belong to anyone. No one was here of enough worth to consider that it was totally okay to come here, because it's terra nullius, is empty land. Okay, so that's how the piece and the question connect, just to offer you that. And then the second question is just, how are Indigenous bodies considered to be empty? So you may not find direct correlations yet, but we'll talk more about that. So if you want to just we're on time constraints, so I'm going to give you 2 minutes to think about it, and then we'll move on. Think about kind of how you answer these questions as we move through some of the stories. But specifically, I also just wanted to say, because I didn't, a lot of the toolkit also you'll find images that express the same stories or the same information, just not in written word. And that's also part of this, is recognizing that a lot of our artwork historically and in contemporary times, a lot of our artworks, we are expressing the harms and the violences that are happening. I think everyone just needs to learn how to read those things in our images as too, right? So media arts justice is one way of talking about these stories and challenging these violences that are happening on our lands and in our communities. So there's a lot that you can unpack with just this one image, which I totally hope that people will. So to move on, the report itself is sectioned in different chapters around different issues. But specifically, because we want to give a general overview, one of the really core beliefs that we have in NYSHN and during this project was that what happens to the land happens to our bodies. So the connection between our land and between the land and our bodies. And so some people can guess what that means. If there's mercury in the water, for example, and we eat something from the water, then there's mercury in our bodies too, or we may experience sickness based on that. But it also means more than that. It is including all of those things, and it also means the ways that industry comes to our communities and what that does. It also means the fracturing, how colonialism has fractured family relationships or community relationships. All of those pieces are about environmental violence too. And so that's something that is directly happening to our lands, but also directly happening to our bodies too. So how our bodies are interacting with that. The other thing that is a really important part of this report is that we recognize specifically that women, youth, and Two-Spirit people have been at the front lines of this type of justice work for a time, for literally ever. And often, they're also the people who are experiencing direct harm and not necessarily having access to the supports needed to address those harms. So this toolkit really not only prioritized the knowledge of those people, but also uplifted what their needs were, how to support them, and also how a peer support model where we're supporting our communities ourselves. another important piece of this is also informed consent. So when we're talking about environmental violence and we're talking about the relationship between our lands, our communities, our bodies, and the harms that are happening to it, and we're thinking about industry or we're thinking about government decisions or any of these things that are happening in our spaces, we have to think about informed consent. And which literally means like being able to agree to something without coercion, with support, having alternative options, all of these things that seem maybe common sense but don't always happen, especially when we're thinking about, well, which Beze will talk later about Amjanong, when we're thinking about issues of like oil industry, for instance, or pipelines. That's a great, which are connected. But so kind of that is the like foundation of this report, and also the foundation of how it can be used in communities and how communities, if they are given the report, can utilize that to support themselves too. So we kind of need to talk about what environmental violence is. That's like kind of an important thing to think about. That's what this toolkit is about addressing, just one form of it. And it is, the definition that we use in the report and in the toolkit is this one. And it is the disproportionate and often devastating impacts that the conscious and deliberate proliferation of environmental toxins in industrial development. So I think that's something that's really important in our definition, is that we use the words conscious and deliberate. This is not an accident. It's not like the previous slide, we were talking about informed consent, right? So people have made decisions, industry has made decisions that are having an impact on women, youth, and Two-Spirit people, and they are having consequences that we are resisting against. Some of those things, which we'll talk about later, about what forms of violence that can look like, some of them you're probably already thinking about, are also included. So things like extraction, mining, oil, things like that. But also another piece of what we're talking about is ongoing chronic social stressors, which are the ongoing impacts of this type of violence. So the ongoing pollution and social stressors caused by development and industry. So some of the examples that we, again, the toolkit is much more detailed around. There's a lot more information about what that looks like. And also for some things that people, which we'll talk about a little bit too, that don't necessarily think about when they think about the harms that are happening. So one of the things is when industry comes to a town and a ton of strangers who are not part of that community come to that town, we have seen that the harm that happens to Indigenous people in that space go up. That's not necessarily that's something that comes to mind when you think about environmental violence, but is something that we, in this toolkit and in this report, we found was like consistently true. So these are some of the forms of environmental violence. You can totally jump in whenever you want. There's probably more, but there's also like these categories are quite big too, right? So it's something to think about, is that we specifically included all of these kind of intersections of loss and harm, because all of these things are connected. So it's not just that we're having an issue with child removal and that's somehow not connected at all to environmental violence. It is absolutely connected to environmental violence. And this toolkit, one of the goals of it and the objectives is to support our communities to see that all of these harms, which is already true for a lot of our communities. They understand these harms are connected, but to find ways to strategically be able to talk about it so that they can start to get these harms addressed. The toolkit goes into more detail about each one of these pieces. And then Beze is going to talk about Amjanong.
So, as I introduced before, I'm from Amjanong. The quote I'm using right now is actually my sister. Me and my sister are kind of interesting. Like, we're both bears, and in our culture, for the clan system, bears are protectors and medicine keepers. And so me and my sister are protectors, land defenders, as we call ourselves. So we're the bear siblings. So my sister does a lot of great quotes, and so this is one of them where the land is our mother. So when we lose value for the land, people lose value for the women. So this is something I want you to think about the entire time that I'm talking. Next slide. Oh, too far. Also, another quote from my sister. She's really good at pumping out quotes. The land underneath these refineries is still sacred. And so as Aboriginal people, we always view the land as something as sacred, because without the land, without the water, without the air, without the animals that we're related to, we will not be able to survive. And so we view them as something as a little bit higher up, as sacred, something that we need to honor, that we need to respect, that we need to love and care for, and that we need to give thanks to. Next slide. So Amchunang is a reservation. If you don't know what a reservation is, it's a tiny slot of land that was given to us, not really given, by the colonizers when they first came. And so reservations have a lot of violence around them because we were forced onto one single little plot of land. And so Amchunang is about 5 kilometers by 5 kilometers. It's not very big. And we have, I have the numbers up there. It's created in 1827. Our actual territories, so we're the Treaty 29, reaches all the way up to Goderich, Ontario. So that's just a little bit past London, Ontario. And then I'm also from Michigan. So my line spread like very wide, but I only have a very tiny reserve to actually, on my status card, call my own. So we're actually part of a few different nations: Amchunang, Kettle and Stony Point, Walpole, Chippewas of the Thames. We were all one nation. And so when you drive down to southern Ontario towards Lake Huron and the St. Clair River, you'll find a few different reserves. And so that is the reserves I mentioned. We were actually all one nation before, or people, as you would say. We weren't split up, and we weren't known as separate. So Amchunang Reserve consists of 2,850 acres of land, which holds 850 residents that live on it, but we actually have over 1,000 band members. We're a border city, so we're right beside Sarnia, Ontario. So if you know where that is, we're right beside there. It was previously known as Chippewas of Sardinia. Amchunang is part of the Chippewa or Ojibwe Nation. The Chippewa Nation includes approximately 10,000 members, so that's everyone in the area towards Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, North Dakota, and Ontario. Our reserve is positioned at the junction of the St. Clair and Lake Huron within the Great Lakes. So we have a very important space that we take care of, that we're supposed to not only give thanks to, but protect. So one thing you may also know about Amchunang is we have what's known as Chemical Valley. Chemical Valley is within a 25-kilometer radius of Amchunang that exists. You can kind of see the map here. Amchunang is right in the middle, and then where 60% of the highest emitting refineries are within this like very, very small kilometer, the red part. And then it spreads like very evenly out, and not like there's not as much industry. So it's all focused surrounding my reserve. And that makes up 40% of Canada's petrochemical industry. Also, some of them are in the US. And the 60% of the highest emitting is in the 5-kilometer radius. So it's not very big that they put the most highest polluting ones in like around my community. So these are some pictures of what it looks like in my community. We have, this is where the daycare used to be centered. And we also have a lot of other things there, like our band office, our ballpark, our church even. And right in the background, you can see all the refineries. And that's what we had to grow up, was a tree line of refineries. I grew up not knowing that things were natural. And so I thought that these big stacks up there were cloud makers. And so I didn't believe that clouds actually came from water or anything. And so when I was like in grade 5, a scientist came into my classroom and was talking about how like the water systems work and how clouds are made, and I didn't believe him. I started like arguing with them and was like, no, I see them being made in my backyard. And so you kind of get like an altered reality. Also, my family liked to travel. It got us out of the house. My parents had 3 kids, so they didn't want us all in the house all at the same time, so they would take us to different places. And so I would see settler communities with parks and without these refineries. But then I would go to Detroit and see the poorer communities, the people of color communities with the Marathon refinery. So the same kind of view I have. And realizing that it was put there for a reason because we were seen as lesser. I actually had to be taught what a reserve was because I was like, hey, we live near a lot of our cousins and aunties and everything, and not understanding that we were put on that piece of land. Next slide. Maybe go next one and then I'll come back to that one. So brief history. Sarnia used to be a logging town. We had a lot of very old trees. As a people, we were very respectful. We were very cautious of, like, we didn't chop down trees and log them away. We would take what we needed from the tree and give thanks to it, like tobacco or water. So we would take care of these things. So we had a lot of trees in our area. But there's a perfect spot right outside Sarnia where there's a divot in the river. And so that's where they would cut down the logs and keep them in the water. And so Sarnia now barely has a lot, they don't have a lot of trees as it used to be. And Aamjiwnaang kept a lot of our trees. So also some history, oil was discovered, and I do discovered with quotations because it's like when you say Columbus discovered America. We already knew about the oil. We knew about the oil from more like the tar sands perspective where it's mixed in with the earth and it's not like in a well. We would use it to patch our canoes up. So it would be at the basins of river and you could see the little black line. And so we would scoop that out and use it to fix our canoes and use it as like kind of a gluey substance, and we wouldn't dig down into the earth for it. And so it was actually discovered by a cow, I found out. There's just oil sitting in the grass and a cow walked in it, and then 4 men were like, hey, we discovered oil. Not far from Aamjiwnaang, which is now called, I love telling people that because they're like, oh, a cow. So not far from Aamjiwnaang, which is now called Oil Springs, it was discovered in 1857, and that was the first time oil was discovered in North America. So it wasn't being used or brought out in the U.S. or anywhere else. It was right there and then that they discovered it. So I'm trying to get a timeline for you guys so you can see from when they discovered it, from when Chemical Valley came up, and then to now. So Imperial Oil was the first one to move to our area, and that was because when they discovered oil, they started refining it, and they started building refineries in different towns. So there's one in Oil Springs, there's one in Petrolia. You can see the kind of like oil names. And then London, Ontario, but London, Ontario's refinery was struck by lightning, and so they moved to Sarnia. And from there, it grew into kind of an empire. So the World War II brought more of the rubber industry. So 1880 was the very first company to come in, Imperial, SO as you would know it, to start refining and building their plant very big. And then World War II brought in more of the synthetic rubbers from Polysar. And synthetic rubber is actually a natural thing. It comes from trees. But from World War II, they needed a lot more of it. And for the atomic bomb actually used rubber. And so they were depleting those trees. And so they had to come up with a way to make rubber instead of growing it. And so the chemical plants started popping up more and more and more, and they started developing those types of things to gear towards the need for oil and the need for rubber and the need for chemicals. Interesting fact about rubber is the chemical plant now that runs it is called Elanxio, and it produces rubber for tires like we use for cars, and also juicy fruit gum. So if you eat juicy fruit gum, that's actually made in my backyard. So what used to be in the area, and this is where I kind of get into the term environmental racism, because they were put in this area for a reason. They were put there because it was land that they could take from us. Our reserve used to be a lot bigger, but they started moving in on us. Imperial is right on the outskirts of Sarnia, in between us and the reserve. And so more chemical plants started popping up, and they were all focused around our area because they would steal the land. They would use the Indian agents to make a crappy deal, and the Indian agents, our people wouldn't be able to speak English, and so they would tell our people a different number than what was actually sold for. And so the land was actually stolen, or it was taken without consent. And so that's the kind of issues that we have with a lot of the pipelines in the area. This is why I call it more of an empire, because there's chemical plants, petroleum plants that make so many different products that we use every day, like even for cleaning products, for different kinds of gases like kerosene and like jet fuels and stuff. So things that we use every day and that come out from 40% my community. Just going with a point. All right, so what brought in more and more different like pipelines, and one two-lane crossing of my community, there's 86 pipelines in the ground. So that poses a lot of, I know a lot about pipelines. In fact, like in different, what are those called? Ditches. So we use ditches to drain the rainwater. There can be pipelines sometimes sticking out of those ditches going across, like they don't go under, they just go across. I used to use those as bridges, and it wasn't until I got older that I realized those were pipelines. Before I just thought that was something I could cross on. And so very familiar with pipelines, trains tip in my community, trains were not put there with our consent. They just put the railways through our community and was like, this, it happened pretty much. So a lot of pipelines without consent. They also made an they put it under the river for trains to get from our side to the American side so that they could do international trading. And then we also had the Great Lakes that lead out to different parts of Canada and the US, and then it also from the St. Clair River leads out to the ocean. So they have the big freighters that can do trading. So our area grew into really a huge empire for them and worked out for the better for them, but not for us. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how Chemical Valley impacts my life. Not only that I didn't understand how clouds are made, but it also impacts our life with respiratory problems. So we were very used to in daycare lining up for puffers, and that was like all the kids that we would line up for a puffer because we weren't able to breathe. So we would breathe in this medical chemicals to be able to breathe our air, because our air, everything is polluted and oxygenal. And so the air will smell like, sometimes it'll smell like sulfur, and that can smell like eggs. So it'll smell like rotten eggs when we were going from the reserve to school in Sarnia, and that would be really weird, like driving through and smelling eggs. Or sometimes you would smell gas, or sometimes you aren't able to smell the chemicals. Benzene is an odorless chemical, and benzene is something that you actually don't have a limit that you can be exposed to. You're not supposed to be exposed to benzene at all. Whereas some chemicals like sulfur, you can have like a little bit exposure and you'll be okay. But with as many companies as we do have, we have a few different companies, but we have a lot of facilities in the area. Like I said, 60 facilities. And so a lot of like thousands and thousands and thousands of chemicals come out of that every day. So we're exposed to a lot of things. So that also led to a 39% miscarriage rate. And as I said, our community is big, like 850 people live in my community, but there's a almost 40% rate of miscarriage. Chemicals are hormone disruptors. And so what that does is that interrupts like for us to have babies. And then also there's toxic substances that are above the guideline that were placed by the Ontario Ministry of Environment and Energy. So we have a lot of different chemicals that are very toxic but released every day. And so that impacts our health, and that impacts our breathing, and that also impacts how we live our life. We can't live traditionally in my community because we can't breathe the air sometimes properly. We also are told sometimes that we can't plant gardens, and so we can't grow any or use any of our traditional medicines. So when I go out picking cedar and give it away as a gift, I will always say, do not use it as tea. Do not consume it. You can burn it, but don't consume it. So that impacts the way that we learn back our teachings and even connect with the land. We have that disconnect because in the back of our community runs a creek called Telford Creek. And can we go back a few slides? There, wait, go back. There. We have signs that are all around our creek that say, keep out, Telford Creek contains toxic substances known to cause serious health risks. And so we grew up afraid of the water. Like, it would be a game not to touch the water. And if you ever grew up with a house with a creek behind it and kids, of course you want to go touch it. You want to go play in it. You want to go catch frogs. But I grew up afraid to touch the water. Whereas my dad a few generations back would swim in Telford Creek. They would swim in the river. Whereas I grew up afraid of it. So that's a different health effect where I couldn't connect with the water. I wasn't able to learn the responsibilities for the water because I was afraid of it. Go back. Oh, back that way. So different chemicals affect different things. So it also affects chemicals that were released because we're kind of used as guinea pigs almost, where they would find out things like last year alone, they found out that benzene actually spreads when it's in the ground. And so they didn't know that before. And so there's a decommissioned pipeline that was from a company that used to be in the Chemical Valley. It was leaking benzene for over 10 years. And then the benzene, once they actually shut off the pipeline, so decommissioned means that it's not in use anymore. And so it was leaking for 10 years. And then it took them another 10 years to figure out a plan how to clean it up because of the 86 pipelines in the area. So they couldn't just stick a shovel in the ground or they could hit a pipeline. So it took them another 10 years. And from what they found out from the benzene was it spread everywhere, which they weren't expecting. So kind of used as guinea pigs, they're finding out things about chemicals. And one of the other things they found out that affect our health is they were a lot less careful as they are today. Today, I can call the company, I feel comfortable calling the companies and reporting a spill, whereas back in the day, they wouldn't be so great about spills. So they would spill all the time, and they would do barrels of we don't even know what, and they would just dump it. They would dump it secretly. And so that introduced a whole bunch of dangerous chemicals, and those chemicals that my grandfather was exposed to are being passed down from generations. So they may no longer be made in the Chemical Valley or produced, but they're being passed down from our dads to our moms and then to us, and then we're going to pass them down. So even if you don't live in the Chemical Valley anymore, you're still impacted. You're still passing down those chemicals, which isn't great when you're thinking about having children. Next slide. So This kind of goes into my next point. The tar sands industry treats women and gender nonconforming bodies in the same way as the earth, with violence and disregard. Pollutants that make the land infertile and the waters undrinkable are also polluting the waters that carry our children in the womb. So this was my friend that Sakura did that quote, and ties in with what I'm talking about with the health. Next slide. So along with the 39 miscarriage rate, we also have a skewed birth ratio. So we have 2 girls for every boy. This is the first time that it's actually happened in the world where people have lived next to industry and the birth ratio is actually split. In different places it can get close to that, but in my community it's actually growing to almost 3 girls for every boy. We haven't done a recent study, but it is growing to a more drastic rate that we're losing the boys in our community. Go back another. Sorry. So we also have had testing as much as we can in our community. Industry, when they provide testing, or the government even, when they provide testing, they only have the legal obligation to give us a report back. So when we do our own testing, it's important to us because then we can get the full results. So one of the things that we found from testing is that we have mercury in our hair, and PCBs, which are now banned in Canada, so they're not here anymore, are in our blood systems. And so these chemicals are in our bodies without consent, and they're being passed down and they're staying there. So even as a person, I'm polluted, and I come from Armstrong. So that kind of sums up my slideshow, talking about how, and hopefully that can help you connect. And this is more of like a case study thing where I'm talking about my experiences growing up next to 40% of Canada's petrochemical industry and realizing how it impacts your body and it impacts the land, and how you see the land, and how you interact with it, especially being an Indigenous person, where we have all these teachings where they're based off the land, they're based off respecting the land, but not being able to do those things is harder for us to learn back our culture and our ways.